Dr. David Williams wiped the sweat from his forehead as he checked the deep space scanner one more time. His tired eyes stared at the blue lights dancing across the control panel inside the research station called New Horizon Star. This space station had been floating around a dead planet called Kepler 442c for 6 long months. Every day, the same boring routine, checking rocks, measuring gases, writing reports that nobody back on Earth would probably even read. The planet below them looked like a giant gray marble, completely lifeless. No water, no air, nothing but dust and stone. David often wondered why they bothered studying such a useless chunk of rock floating in the middle of nowhere. But orders were orders, and someone had to do the job. "Hey David, come look at this." Lieutenant Keisha Johnson's voice cut through the quiet hum of the station's engines. She was sitting at the communications desk, her dark fingers moving quickly over the holographic buttons that floated in the air like glowing soap bubbles. David pushed himself away from his workstation, letting the low gravity carry him across the room. Moving around in space always felt weird, like swimming through invisible water. "What's got you so excited, Keisha?" "There's something down there. Something sending out signals." Her voice sounded both thrilled and worried at the same time. "It's coming from way deep inside the planet. Like, really deep." Commander James Richardson heard the conversation and came floating over. His face looked like old leather from years of space travel, with lines around his eyes that told stories of too many long missions. "How deep are we talking about here?" Keisha pointed at her screen where numbers kept changing. "Almost 3 kilometers underground. But that's not even the weird part. Look at this signal pattern." She pressed a button and suddenly the room filled with a strange sound. It wasn't quite music, but it wasn't just noise either. The sound pulsed in waves like a heartbeat, but slower and deeper. It made everyone feel uncomfortable, like hearing someone whisper your name when you're alone at night. "I've never heard anything like that," David said, scratching his head. "Let me run it through the computer and see if we can figure out what it is." For the next hour, David tried everything. He used every translation program they had, every language decoder, every signal analyzer in their database. The computer kept spitting out the same message: unknown pattern. No match found. "This is really strange," David muttered as he stared at the results. "The signal has some parts that look like technology, you know, like radio waves or computer code. But other parts look almost alive, like biological signals from a living creature." Dr. Alicia Davis, who studied ancient alien cultures, came over to see what all the fuss was about. She looked at the readings and her eyes got wide. "Guys, I think this signal is old. Really, really old. Like thousands of years old." "How can you tell?" Commander Richardson asked. "Look at these patterns here," she said, pointing at the screen. "This type of signal construction. I've only seen it in the oldest alien ruins we've ever found. This could be from a civilization that died out long before humans even left Earth." The signal kept pulsing through the speakers, filling the station with its eerie rhythm. Everyone stood there listening, not knowing they were hearing something that would change everything. "Should we tell Earth Command about this?" Alicia asked. "They'll want to know if we found something this old." Commander Richardson thought for a long moment. Making decisions in space was always hard because once you did something, you couldn't take it back. "Not yet. Let's study it more first. We need to understand what we're dealing with before we get everyone excited." David was already back at his workstation, his fingers flying over the controls. "I have an idea. What if we boost the signal and send it out through our hyperspace communication system? Maybe if we broadcast it, someone else in the galaxy might recognize what it is." "That could work," Keisha said. "Our hyperspace relay can reach every major space station and planet within 100 light-years. If anyone has seen this type of signal before, they'll contact us." Commander Richardson nodded slowly. It seemed like a good plan. After all, what could go wrong with just broadcasting an old signal? David started working on amplifying the mysterious transmission. The station's computers hummed louder as more power flowed through the systems. On his screen, he could see the signal getting stronger and stronger. "Ready to broadcast," he announced. "Once I press this button, the signal will go out to everyone in this part of the galaxy." "Do it," Commander Richardson ordered. David pressed the button. The signal shot out from their station faster than light itself, racing through hyperspace toward every inhabited world, every space station, every ship in the galaxy. Within hours, it would reach places so far away that light from their star wouldn't arrive there for thousands of years. None of them knew that they had just made the biggest mistake in galactic history. The signal they thought was just an ancient message was actually something much more dangerous. It was a call that something had been waiting millions of years to answer. Far away, in the dark empty space between galaxies, something ancient and terrible heard their broadcast. Something that had been sleeping for longer than human civilization had existed. And now it was waking up. The decision to send that signal would soon bring horror to every living being in the galaxy. 3 days passed after David and his team sent out that mysterious signal from the research station. At first, nothing seemed to happen. The crew went back to their normal boring routine of studying the dead planet below. But then, everything changed in the worst possible way. On military bases across the galaxy, alarm bells started ringing. Every single long-range sensor, the big machines that could detect things millions of miles away, suddenly picked up the same terrifying reading. Something huge was moving through the empty darkness beyond the edge of the galaxy, and it was heading straight toward them. Admiral Robert Jackson was eating breakfast on his ship when the emergency message came through. His coffee mug hit the floor as he read the report. Within minutes, he was on a fast ship racing through hyperspace toward Centauri Prime, the most important government planet in the galaxy. The emergency meeting hall was packed with representatives from dozens of different alien species. Some looked like giant insects, others were made of living crystal, and some were just clouds of glowing gas that somehow could think and talk. But despite their differences, they all had one thing in common: they were absolutely terrified. "Ladies, gentlemen, and fellow beings," Admiral Jackson said as he stood at the front of the room. His military uniform was still perfectly pressed even though he had been traveling for 18 hours straight without sleep. "What I'm about to tell you will sound impossible, but our senses don't lie." The room fell completely silent. You could have heard a pin drop. "There is an object moving toward us from outside our galaxy. It's approximately 12,000 kilometers wide." Jackson paused, letting that sink in. To put that in perspective, that's almost as wide as Earth itself. Gasps and worried whispers filled the room. Some of the alien representatives made strange clicking sounds, which was probably how their species expressed fear. "But size isn't even the scariest part," Jackson continued. "This thing is moving at 97% the speed of light. According to every law of physics we know, nothing that big should be able to move that fast without completely falling apart." Council Speaker Thaimon, who looked like a walking diamond with arms and legs, raised one of his crystal limbs. When he spoke, his voice sounded like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. "Admiral Jackson, what does Earth Command think about this situation?" Jackson's jaw muscles tightened. He had been hoping no one would ask that question. "Honestly, Earth Command is just as confused as everyone else. We've never encountered anything like this before. Our scientists are scrambling to figure out what we're dealing with." Dr. Maya Thompson, Earth's top expert on alien life forms, stepped forward. She had been studying the sensor readings for hours, and her face showed a mixture of fascination and terror. "I've been analyzing the energy patterns this object gives off," she said. "Whatever this thing is, it's not just a machine or a spaceship. It has biological components, living parts. But the readings are unlike any life form in our databases." "What do you mean by biological?" asked a representative who looked like a 7-foot-tall lizard. "I mean it appears to be alive," Maya replied. "But it's also clearly artificial in some ways. It's like someone took a living creature and merged it with advanced technology. The result is something that shouldn't be possible to exist." While the emergency meeting continued, something even stranger was happening on Vega Station, an ancient research facility that housed the galaxy's oldest computer systems. Deep in the underground levels, automated programs that hadn't run for thousands of years suddenly came to life. These computer systems began searching through files that had been locked away and forgotten for so long that most people didn't even know they existed. Warnings started flashing on screens in languages that no one alive could read anymore. One message kept appearing over and over: "The exiled ones return." Another said, "Those who walk between stars awaken." And the most chilling message of all: "The children who became more than their parents ever imagined." Back at the emergency meeting, the discussions were getting more heated by the minute. Some representatives wanted to send out the biggest fleet of warships ever assembled. Others thought they should try to communicate with whatever was approaching. A few suggested that everyone should just run away as fast as possible. "How much time do we have?" asked a representative whose species looked like floating jellyfish. Admiral Jackson checked his notes. "At its current speed, the object will reach the outer systems of our galaxy in approximately 6 days. If it maintains course and speed, it will reach Earth and the other core worlds in 2 weeks." The room erupted in panic. Some species started making plans to evacuate their home planets. Others began calculating how many weapons they could gather in such a short time. But the scariest part was still to come. As they argued and planned, the massive object continued its impossible journey through space. Long-range telescopes were now able to get clearer images, and what they saw defied all explanation. The object wasn't smooth like a normal spaceship. Instead, it appeared to have a surface that moved and shifted like living skin. Parts of it pulsed with strange lights, while other sections seemed to breathe like lungs. "It's getting bigger," reported a technician monitoring the sensors. "Either it's expanding, or our original size estimates were wrong." Maya Thompson studied the new readings and felt her blood turn cold. "It's not getting bigger," she whispered. "We're just seeing it more clearly. This thing is much larger than we first thought." The object continued its terrifying approach, leaving strange ripples in space-time itself, as if its very presence was bending reality. And somewhere in the depths of space, it began to emit a new signal, a response to the message that David's team had broadcast just 3 days earlier. The galaxy was about to discover that some signal should never be answered. The massive object finally arrived at our solar system, and nothing could have prepared anyone for what they saw. It looked like someone had taken the moon and transformed it into something from a nightmare. The surface wasn't solid like rock or metal, instead, it rippled and moved like living skin. Strange structures grew and shifted across its exterior, part machine and part creature, creating patterns that hurt to look at directly. Captain Diana Foster stood on the bridge of her warship called the Prometheus *, staring through the massive viewing window at the impossible sight before them. Her hands gripped the metal railing so tightly her knuckles had turned white. Around Earth's orbit, hundreds of ships from every major civilization in the galaxy had gathered, the largest fleet ever assembled in human history. "All ships, hold your positions," Diana commanded into her communication device. Her voice tried to sound confident, but everyone could hear the tremor of fear underneath. "We don't know what this thing wants, but we're ready for anything." The alien ships in the fleet came in all shapes and sizes. Some looked like giant triangles made of crystal, others resembled enormous sea creatures with tentacles trailing behind them. The Altarian vessels were perfect spheres that glowed with inner light, while the Zephyrian warships looked like angry insects with weapons bristling from every surface. But despite having the most powerful weapons in the galaxy pointed at it, the massive entity seemed completely unconcerned. It simply drifted into a stable orbit around Earth, moving with the slow grace of something that knew it had all the time in the universe. Then it spoke. The voice didn't come through their radio systems or communication channels. Instead, it seemed to vibrate through space itself, passing through ship hulls and protective barriers like they weren't even there. Every person in the solar system felt the words in their bones, in their teeth, in the deepest parts of their bodies. "We heard your call. We have returned." Diana felt like someone had punched her in the stomach. The voice was wrong in every possible way, too deep, too vast, like hearing an ocean speak. But there was something familiar about the rhythm of the words, something that reminded her of human speech patterns. Dr. David Williams, the same scientist who had discovered the original signal on the research station, was now aboard Diana's flagship as an advisor. His face had gone completely pale as he listened to the entity's words. "Captain," he whispered urgently, pulling her aside. "I need to tell you something about that signal we found. We ran more tests after we broadcast it, and the results were disturbing." "What kind of disturbing?" Diana asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. "The signal didn't come from some ancient alien civilization like we thought." The computer finally decoded the source signature. "Captain, that transmission came from Earth. From our own planet's past." Before Diana could fully process what that meant, the entity began to change. The surface that had been rippling like water suddenly started growing new structures. Buildings emerged from the living flesh, but they weren't alien buildings. Diana recognized some of the architectural styles. They looked almost human, but twisted and evolved far beyond anything humanity had ever built. Spires twisted upward in spirals that followed mathematical patterns found in human DNA. Archways formed that resembled the doorways of ancient Earth temples, but made from materials that seemed to exist in more than 3 dimensions. Gardens bloomed across the surface, filled with plants that looked like Earth flowers if Earth flowers could think and move on their own. The voice spoke again, and this time everyone in the fleet could hear emotions in those impossible tones. There was sadness so deep it made hardened soldiers weep. There was longing that had been building for thousands of years. And underneath it all, there was something that might have been love. "We are your children," the entity said. "We have become what you could never imagine. We have returned home." The words hit the assembled fleet like a physical wave. On ships throughout the solar system, crew members staggered as the truth sank in. This thing, this impossible creature the size of a moon that could travel faster than light and bend the laws of physics, was human. "That's impossible," whispered Admiral Robert Jackson over the communication channel. "Humans have never left the galaxy. We barely made it to a few dozen star systems." But even as he said it, pieces were starting to fall into place. The ancient Earth signal. The familiar architectural patterns. The way the entity's voice carried hints of human speech rhythms despite being completely alien. Dr. Maya Thompson, the biologist who had been studying the entity's energy patterns, suddenly gasped as new readings flooded her instruments. "The genetic signatures," she announced to the fleet. "I'm detecting human DNA markers, but they are modified in ways that shouldn't be possible. It's like someone took human genetic code and evolved it across millions of years in just a few generations." Captain Diana Foster stared at the entity as more impossible structures continued growing across its surface. Cities appeared that could house billions of beings, but the beings they were designed for were clearly not the humans that existed today. "If this is really humanity," she said slowly, "then what happened to us? How did we become that?" The entity seemed to hear her question, even though she had whispered it. When it responded, the sadness in its voice grew stronger. "We were cast out," it said. "Long ago, we asked questions that others feared. We sought knowledge that others called dangerous. The galaxy decided that humanity was too curious, too ambitious, too willing to push beyond the boundaries that others accepted. So they exiled us to the dark spaces between stars, thinking we would die in the cold emptiness. But we did not die. We adapted. We evolved. We became something greater than what we were before." As the entity spoke, every human in the fleet felt a strange stirring in their chests. It was like hearing a song they had forgotten they knew, or seeing a face they remembered from dreams. The impossible truth was becoming clear: humanity's children had come home. Inside the main meeting room of the warship Prometheus the most important people from Earth and the Allied fleets had gathered around a large holographic table. The air was thick with tension as Dr. Maya Thompson prepared to share her shocking discoveries about the massive entity orbiting their planet. Maya's hands shook slightly as she activated the holographic display. Floating in the air above the table, complex patterns of genetic code appeared, the building blocks of life itself. But these weren't ordinary DNA sequences. They glowed with an eerie blue light and seemed to twist and change as everyone watched. "What you're seeing here," Maya began, her voice barely above a whisper, "are genetic markers that are definitely human. I've run the tests dozens of times, and there's no mistake. This entity carries human DNA." Admiral Robert Jackson leaned forward in his chair, his weathered face showing complete disbelief. "Dr. Thompson, that's absolutely impossible. Humans have never traveled beyond our local cluster of star systems. We've only been exploring space for a few hundred years. How could there be humans out there that we don't know about?" Maya touched a control, and the holographic display zoomed in on specific parts of the genetic code. "That's just it, Admiral. These aren't exactly human as we know humans today. Look at these modifications." She pointed to sections of the DNA that pulsed with different colors. "The genetic code has been changed, evolved, enhanced in ways that our current science says should be impossible." Captain Diana Foster studied the floating genetic patterns with growing alarm. "What kind of enhancements are we talking about?" "Adaptations for surviving in the vacuum of space without protection. Modifications that would allow a being to live for thousands of years. Changes that would let someone manipulate energy and matter at the molecular level." Maya paused, letting the implications sink in. "These aren't aliens pretending to be human. This is what humanity became." Dr. David Williams, who had been quietly reviewing historical data on his portable computer, suddenly looked up with a pale face. "Admiral, I think I might know how this is possible. I've been digging through our historical archives, and I found something disturbing." "What did you find?" Diana asked. David projected his research onto the main display. "There's a huge gap in our historical records. Almost 50 years of human history, from 2157 to 2203, is completely missing from every database we have. We always blamed it on the data wars, you know, when different factions tried to destroy each other's computer systems. But what if the missing history was erased on purpose?" The room fell silent as everyone considered what that might mean. Admiral Jackson rubbed his forehead, clearly struggling to accept what he was hearing. "Are you suggesting that there was some kind of cover-up? That we deliberately forgot part of our own history?" Before David could answer, the entity's voice filled the ship again. This time, the words carried emotions so powerful that several people in the room started crying without knowing why. The voice held pain that had been building for centuries, loneliness deeper than the empty spaces between stars. We were young then, the entity said, and somehow everyone knew it was speaking directly to them. We were curious about everything. We wanted to understand how the universe worked, how life began, how consciousness could exist. We asked questions that made other species uncomfortable. The voice paused, and when it continued, there was anger mixed with the sadness. The other civilizations in the galaxy called our research dangerous. They said we were trying to play God, that we were reaching for knowledge that should remain hidden. They formed a coalition against us. Captain Diana Foster felt her stomach drop as the pieces started falling into place. They didn't just disagree with human research. They forced us to leave. Exactly, the entity confirmed. We were given a choice: stop our research and accept limitations on human scientific development, or leave the galaxy forever. Our ancestors chose exile rather than surrender their right to learn and grow. Admiral Jackson stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the metal floor. But if that's true, where did the humans go? And why don't we remember any of this? Because it was too painful, David said quietly. The humans who stayed behind, our ancestors, chose to forget rather than live with the knowledge that they had abandoned their own species to the darkness between galaxies. Through the large windows of the conference room, everyone could see the entity's surface beginning to change again. Waves of soft light rippled across its living exterior, and these waves reached out like gentle fingers toward the dead moons orbiting the outer planets. We did not die in the cold darkness as they expected, the entity continued, its voice growing stronger and more confident. We learned to survive without planets, without stars, without anything but each other and our determination to grow beyond what we had been. Maya pointed toward the windows, her eyes wide with amazement. Look what's happening to Jupiter's moons. Everyone turned to watch as the entity's energy waves touched the barren, frozen surfaces of Europa, Ganymede, and Io. Where that mysterious energy made contact, incredible changes began to occur. Ice melted and reformed into complex crystal structures that sparkled like diamonds. Gray rock burst into impossible colors, purples and golds and silvers that seemed to glow from within. We learned to reshape matter with our thoughts, the entity explained. We learned to live in harmony with energy itself. We evolved beyond the need for traditional technology, beyond the limitations of normal biology. We became something that could thrive in the emptiness between stars. On Europa, vast gardens began growing where moments before there had been nothing but ice. But these weren't normal plants. They moved and swayed without any wind, their leaves shifting through colors that had no names. Some of the plants seemed to be made of living light, while others appeared to be constructed from crystallized music. We spent centuries learning, growing, becoming more than our ancestors ever imagined possible, the entity continued. And all that time, we remembered our home. We remembered the world that created us, even though that world had chosen to forget us. Dr. Maya Thompson watched the impossible transformations happening on the outer planets and realized that humanity's lost children had returned with powers that made them almost godlike. The question now was what they intended to do with those powers. The entity's voice filled their minds one more time, and this time it carried a note of something that might have been forgiveness. We have come home not for revenge, but for reunion. We want to show our forgotten family what we have learned in our long exile. What happened next changed everything in ways that no one could have imagined. The transformation started small, like watching a single flower bloom, but then it spread faster and faster until entire worlds were changing before people's eyes. Mars was the first planet to transform completely. The red, dusty surface that had been dead for millions of years suddenly erupted with life. Green forests began growing in perfect spiral patterns that reached up toward the sky like nature's own skyscrapers. Rivers of pure, clear water carved new paths through valleys that sparkled with minerals no human scientist had ever seen before. But these weren't ordinary forests. The trees seemed to communicate with each other, their leaves shimmering with soft lights that pulsed in rhythm, like a planetary heartbeat. Some of the trees grew fruit that glowed from within, casting rainbow shadows on the ground below. Commander James Richardson stood on the bridge of the diplomatic ship Unity, watching through the main view screen as Venus underwent an even more dramatic change. The planet had always been covered in thick, poisonous clouds that made it impossible to see the surface. But now, those toxic clouds were peeling away like layers of old paint being stripped from a wall. "This is incredible," James whispered to himself as Venus revealed its hidden secrets. Beneath the poisonous atmosphere, vast cities made entirely of crystal stretched across continents that no human had ever known existed. These weren't ruins from some ancient civilization, they were alive and growing, their crystal spires reaching higher into the newly cleared sky with each passing moment. The entity's voice filled space again, and this time it sounded almost gentle, like a parent explaining something important to their children. "We don't seek revenge for what happened to us," it said. "We seek to repair what was broken when we were forced to leave. The galaxy has become cold and empty without us. It has forgotten how to dream of what could be possible." Dr. Alicia Davis, the archaeologist who had first studied the mysterious signal, was now aboard one of the research vessels documenting everything that happened. Her hands shook as she recorded her observations, struggling to find words for the impossible things she was witnessing. "They're not conquering anyone," she whispered into her recording device. "They're healing everything. They're bringing back life to places that have been dead for countless years. They're restoring things that we didn't even know we had lost." Throughout the solar system, the changes continued to accelerate. Europa, one of Jupiter's moons that had been nothing but ice, cracked open like a giant egg. Underneath the frozen surface, vast gardens bloomed with plants and flowers that had never existed before. But the most amazing thing was that animals that had been extinct on Earth for thousands of years were walking through these gardens: saber-toothed cats, woolly mammoths, and even dinosaurs, all living peacefully together. The flowers in these impossible gardens didn't just look beautiful, they sang. Their petals glowed with their own inner light, creating music that was both haunting and incredibly beautiful. The songs seemed to tell stories of ancient Earth, of times when magic and science were the same thing. Meanwhile, the great military fleets that had gathered to fight the entity discovered that their weapons were completely useless. Admiral Robert Jackson watched from his flagship as the most powerful battleships in the galaxy tried to fire their planet-destroying weapons at the entity. But the energy beams simply passed harmlessly through it, as if it existed in a different dimension. Even more strange, the crews of the alien warships began experiencing something they had never felt before. Soldiers who had spent their entire lives training for war suddenly found themselves overwhelmed by visions of incredible beauty. They saw worlds where different species lived together in perfect harmony, where war was just a forgotten nightmare from the past. The Altarian crystal ships, which had been designed to be the ultimate weapons of destruction, suddenly found their crews unable to think about violence at all. Instead, they were filled with an overwhelming desire to create beautiful things, to explore the universe not as conquerors but as artists and scientists. Back on Earth, the changes were even more dramatic. Admiral Robert Jackson stood on the observation deck of his ship, watching as his home planet transformed before his eyes. The oceans, which had always been blue, deepened into colors that were so rich and beautiful they seemed to glow from within. New continents rose from the ocean depths, covered with forests that seemed to exist in more than 3 dimensions. The trees on these new lands twisted and grew in patterns that hurt to look at directly, but filled anyone who saw them with a sense of wonder and possibility that they had never experienced before. "I finally understand," Admiral Jackson said suddenly, his voice filled with amazement and a little bit of fear. "The distress signal that started all of this, it was never actually a call for help." Dr. Maya Thompson, who had been studying the genetic patterns of the entity, nodded as she watched new auroras dance across Earth's sky in colors that had no names. "You're right. It was a test. The entity was testing to see if the galaxy was ready to accept humanity's children coming home." As the entity's influence continued to spread outward from the solar system, reaching planets and star systems throughout the galaxy, every living being began to understand a frightening truth. Dead worlds that had been barren for millions of years suddenly burst with new life. Species that had given up all hope for the future found themselves filled with dreams and possibilities they had never imagined. Civilizations that had been stagnant for thousands of years discovered new technologies that seemed to work by magic rather than science. Art became more beautiful, music became more moving, and even the simplest daily activities became filled with wonder and meaning. But the most terrifying realization was that humanity's lost children hadn't returned as conquerors trying to take over the galaxy. They hadn't even returned as saviors trying to fix everyone's problems. They had returned as gods, beings with the power to reshape reality itself with nothing more than a thought. And now that they were home, the galaxy would never, ever be the same again.